Alrighty, so we are in the end of Acts chapter 14 this week, finishing off not only the chapter but of course also the Apostle Paul's first missionary journey. So we're covering verses 19 through to the end in verse 28. So let me read the passage, we'll pray and then we'll commence from there. So Acts chapter 14, verse 19 to 28. But the Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and after winning over the crowds and stoning Paul, they were dragging him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. But while the disciples stood around him, he rose up and entered the city. The next day he went with Barnabas to Derbe. And after they had proclaimed the gospel to that city and made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch, strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying, "Through many afflictions we must enter the kingdom of God." And when they had appointed elders for them in every church, having prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord in whom they had believed. And when they passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia, and when they had spoken the word in Perga, they came down to Italia. And from there they sailed to Antioch, from where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they had arrived and gathered the church together, they began to report all things that God had done with them, and how He had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they spent not a little time with the disciples. Let us pray. Blessed Lord, who caused all holy scriptures to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, to read them, to mark them, to learn them, and to inwardly digest them, in order that we may embrace and ever hold fast to the blessed hope in Jesus Christ. Amen. So yes, this passage obviously finishes off the journey, and we get X amount of details that occur here in the tail end of Lystra, and then we get the reference to them having gone to Derbe, and then we get a comparatively quick literary backtracking or finishing of the story as they retrace their steps from whence they came, with the exception being obviously the trip to Cyprus. There are a number of important details in here and other such things that we'll cover kind of as we go through. So let's begin in verse 19. But Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and after winning over the crowds and stoning Paul, they were dragging him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. So keep in mind that we have been in Lystra, and we have seen in this particular city Paul and co, particularly Paul and Barnabas, preaching to the Gentiles specifically. We had the incident in the last lesson in verses 8 through 18 where the people in the city figured them to be Zeus and Hermes, based on a story going back many centuries, at least 800 to 1,000 years in their folklore. You can find that in a number of different texts, like Ovid's Metamorphoses, for example, that we referenced in the last lesson. Nevertheless, they made sure, and they went to great lengths to ensure that they were not worshipped by the people, and they were not mistaken for gods, but instead pointed them to the living God, the one who made the heavens and the earth and everything therein. This is going relatively well to a degree, right up until
the stoning.
right up until the Jews arrive from other cities. A couple of points. One being the fact that we've already seen this thus far. We've seen it all the way through the book of Acts. We will continue to see it through the book of Acts. The almost endless lengths to which the Jews go to silence and to destroy utterly and entirely. Not only the messengers themselves, but even the message by extension. it figures as to why Christ then later refers to them as, for example, the synagogue of Satan. Meant to in one sense be a pun, but also not really, by virtue of him explaining quite clearly in those opening chapters of the Revelation that they have become servants not of Yahweh but of their father the devil, to use that terminology. The Messiah was sent to them, and obviously there's no shortage of Jews who have believed. I mean, the whole Church of Jerusalem's like that. Paul's like that. You've got people here. Barnabas is again a Cypriot Jew. You've got Jews who have believed, but those who have rejected are not, even to use the same Apostle Paul's words, they're not the real Jews. The real Jews have followed the Messiah, because they have known the faith of their fathers. That's why so many times we've seen thus far throughout the book of Acts. What do? Especially when talking to the Jews. They go back to Abraham and to Moses and to David, right? This is exactly the one, Jesus, the Christ, who's the one who all of them, Abraham, Moses, David, etc., looked forward to. That's the one who they placed their faith in. They placed their faith in the Lord, and that indeed the Messiah would fulfill all that had been promised by God. Here, though, they have rejected it. They've knowingly rejected it, and indeed they've done so at a time when they should have otherwise been expecting. Because again, Daniel himself foretold of what the time period was. They all knew about the time period. That's why no one was astoundingly shocked when the Magi turned up. Right? The only person who didn't like it was, of course, King Herod, the king, because the real king of the Jews had been born. But no one else was shocked. That's why they were able to find the scriptures relatively quickly and point it out. And the fact that you even had magicians, wise men from the east, which almost certainly means Babylon, who had looked into the heavens and seen things going on that they themselves, even in their own pagan setting, knew, oh, this must be the birth of someone very important. They've come, but meanwhile you've got Jews like King Herod, who out of the pride and arrogance and evil reject that and decide instead, I'm going to kill all the boys under the age of 2. It's been this is why he refers to them as a wicked and corrupt generation. And so they arrive from Antioch and Iconium. That also probably suggests, by the way, when it says Antioch here, it's obviously talking about Pisidian Antioch, not Syrian. So Pisidian Antioch, which is one of the cities we've been through on this journey. The fact that they're coming from Antioch and Iconium also probably suggests logistically that they've been tracking Paul and Barnabas. Does that make sense?
Definitely.
They've been tracking them as they've been following them and tracking them and like hunting them. So this is not just some spur of the moment. They've been traveling at this point hundreds of kilometers tracking them.
Just like Paul did on his way to Damascus, tracking down the Christians.
Exactly, the Christians in the church.
Very same thing.
Exactly, same deal, 100%. Which is exactly the point being made. And so this is not them just like in their immediate anger, even though that would be unjustified, of course. They're actually actively tracking them and doing the same things that Paul, then Saul himself, was doing. And so they eventually obviously catch up to them in Lystra, and they win over the crowds, meaning they convince, they rally and inflame the mob.
What would they have said? Because to stone someone,
blasphemy,
is very serious.
Blasphemy.
And what would have riled up the crowd? What wording would have riled up the crowd so?
Yeah, it's interesting because what we see is the context would seem to indicate that when it's talking about them riling up the crowds, it's talking about them riling up the crowds which we've just been dealing with, which are Gentiles. That's what it would seem to suggest. Doesn't mean there was no Jews there, but we've just had a whole exposition where he's talking to Gentiles, and the fact that we have a conjunction, in this case a negative conjunction, allos, but shows that there's a continuation, but it's in contrast in verse 19. So the crowds that would be suggested here would be the ones that have been in view in verses 8 to 18, would be my suggestion. So yeah, it's a mix. I'd say Because typically the punishment, like stoning someone to death, is typically what they would have done for someone who blasphemed.
Which suggests that the crowds were Jewish because they were putting into effect the Mosaic law to stone someone for blasphemy.
Exactly. It may exactly. That's why it's a bit of an oddity. It also may be. It could be a factor of all of the above. So it could also be a factor of riling up the Gentiles who are there anyway because they've thought these are the gods and they're not really. And so it could also be in that essence, right? You couldn't just roll around pretending to be Zeus. That wasn't okay to do. It's probably a combination of all the above. There's probably also Jews. They've also probably also brought Jews with them. Do you know what I mean? I'm saying it's not just like, a couple of guys came from like Iconium. This would be a group, a party of them.
It's possible that they offered them monetary bribes.
Correct, we've seen that before, and so certainly things along those lines. And so all of the above, no matter which way you dissect it, it's clear that there's again, keeping in mind, even the attempt to stone them for blasphemy is also completely unlawful because they're not actually blaspheming. So no matter what way we kind of dissect this, the whole thing is a kangaroo court in the first place. Do you know what I mean? The whole thing is completely unlawful and immoral anyway. And so, yeah.
Were they the people that Paul and Barnabas have been talking to?
Yep. Yes. So that's it's the amalgamation of the crowd they were talking to. I would suggest probably plus this other group of Jews, plus any Jews that may have been in the city anyway. So it's probably a mixture of Jewish Gentile. What group we're not kind of told. But either way, they win over the crowd and they then whip them up into a frenzy. And stone Paul, and they drag obviously quite successfully. So obviously managed to they're not kind of stoning him as he's running away. They obviously managed to corner, capture, anything, apprehend in some cases, and they stone him pretty brutally to the point where they drag him outside the city and toss him out the city and leave him because they figure he's probably dead. So he's beaten very, very, very badly. To the point where they thought, all right, he's probably dead.
There is Scripture interprets Scripture, of course, and I hadn't thought of this before, but the wording is thinking he had died. Where else in Scripture does the surrounding crowd think that the individual has died? In at least two other places, and to the non-believer, of course, the body is dead. But Jesus said of the others that were raised from the dead, she or he is sleeping.
Yes.
So they definitely killed, in my humble view, they definitely killed Paul. I mean, he died according to mortal eye, human eyes. He's dead. But according to scriptural eyes, he was going to be raised, and that's what happened when the disciples circled him. And they would have prayed, and there would have been a miracle.
Yep, that's one of the. There's basically two broad kind of historical interpretations that we find. So it's that one, essentially, that he's supposing him to be dead, meaning that he did actually die, and was then revived. Kind of, I was not resurrected in the sense that like Christ was, because that he's the only one thus far been that, but revived in the sense of like Lazarus. So obviously, he would go on to continue to die, right? So the difference between reviving and resurrection, I'm just pointing out for our theological sake. When I say resurrected, I don't mean like Christ has been resurrected into glory, because Lazarus died later, right? And people like that died later. So it's a reviving, right? Bringing back life. That's one. That's the one. And then the other is simply that he was on death's doorstep, right? So that they supposed him to be dead, but God had miraculously spared him from actually dying. Both kind of fit within, in terms of the literary framework, and even the literary framework, both kind of fit. Theologically, there's no gigantic problem whether you go one way or the other. So it's not like it doesn't make or break anything in any meaningful sense. So literarily, both completely fit within that. Exactly what you said. I'm not even necessarily offering which one I think. There's good argument on kind of both sides. Both sides of the equation provide for what's accounted for literarily, and both would be miraculous anyway. Because even if he hasn't died and they're supposed to be dead, that's God having spared him. But he's so brutally beaten here. Yeah.
I'm going to use the controversial term dispensational period. I believe we're in this special period where miracles are of critical importance.
Here.
Yes,
Yep.
in this early stage of the church.
Yeah, definitely.
And I would argue that there was a miracle.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely 100% possible with everything that's being said here. Yeah, no doubt. No, I'm not questioning that for a second. Yeah, it's the disciples standing around him rising up and then entering the city. The language of rise up, again, it's the same deal. The language of rose up, what is being meant there. There's no particular interesting use of a word. Like the language that we're getting here is quite normal, because especially if we had like a hapax legomenon where it's a word that's used once, that would definitely raise eyebrows. Him rising up, let me go and see exactly what they're saying here. Yeah, again, it's just, and you'll know what I mean. It's simply anastasis, right? So it's the word that gets used for both, like Christ being raised as well as Lazarus being raised. That word kind of the word doesn't necessarily inform for us what the context is, because the word gets used of Christ as well as it gets used of Lazarus. But absolutely, but when you're seeing the word like that kind of word being used here, again, all that's completely in the realm of possibility that he actually did die and was then revived like Lazarus.
He tells us later, of course, in one of the epistles that he was carried to the third heaven.
That's right.
Yep. Whether that's here or not, who knows? Could be. Obviously not told in the context when he talks about it. Could be. It's just we're simply not told. But the point being is that one way or the other, the framing that should be understood here is that when he gets up and walks back into the city, everyone would have been utterly shocked.
Absolutely.
So that the effect is 100% the same one way or the other, because even if it was God miraculously sparing him from death, they all thought he was dead, right? Because he was probably knocked again. Would have been knocked unconscious, bleeding, completely disfigured, broken bones left, right, and centre.
Miracles are
Fancy
to
getting up. Oh my goodness.
miracles are always to glorify the Lord Jesus Christ.
Exactly, and that's the case here. Yeah.
And when he did re-enter the city and was seen by a multitude,
Correct.
I would say that part of that multitude became believers.
It is, and that's exactly what we get onto 100%. And so we'll get onto that as we go through the text. Because one thing to consider here, and this is the bigger picture point, is that dying and being revived miraculously by God, who is the giver and taker of life, or being inches from death, but God sparing him from death and him getting up anyway, both of those are beyond the we have a difficult time envisioning what stoning someone looks like. It is very, very brutal. Broken bones, fractures, compound fractures, crushed ribs, pierced lungs, tension pneumothorax, breathing problem, bleeding internally, bleeding in the brain, blown out fractures in the skull. Like, it's horrific, right? When you have 30, 40, 50, count a number of people throwing stones and rocks at you, it doesn't really go well. And that beating is brutal, let alone just the sheer concussive effect. Hence why they would have supposed to be dead. At the bare minimum, he is very, very badly, like grade 3 knocked out here. And probably unconscious for minutes and minutes and minutes on end, which is why they think he's dead. And that's a very, very long time to be knocked out. And so even him getting up and walking back into the city with broken bones left, right, and centre, or everything you can imagine, crushed orbital fractures, nose gone, teeth gone, lungs, face, eyes, the head, the whole box and dice. The fact that he even got up off the ground is already
That's a miracle.
miraculous enough. It really is. Like, take it from someone who's trained many, many years in mixed martial arts, and I've seen guys get knocked out very, very badly. That's like 1/10 of what getting stoned is. The fact that he gets up at all, whether he dies and is revived or whether he's spared, is already just incredible. And so then him walking for the exact purpose you're talking about there, he rises up and enters the city, and that in itself would have been the sign and testimony of the power of God over life and death, and also of his preservation of those of his messengers in this case. Does that make sense? All for a purpose, which is exactly what Costa was mentioning earlier. And so the next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe, which is, if you happen to have your maps, they head from Lystra to Derbe, which is kind of just almost due east.
Can I just make a point of that?
Yep, go for it.
Again, amazing when you look at these scriptures and you've seen them 100 times and it's still giving.
You find something else, yeah, sure.
I've
Yeah.
never noticed before that he'd already preached in where are we? In
Lystra.
we're in Lystra.
Yep.
Yeah.
So he'd already preached in Lystra. He was rejected. He was stoned to death.
Yep.
And when he rises, he's not going to re-preach because he's already preached. And the Bible says if they reject you in one city, shake the dust off your feet
Yeah.
visibly to the inhabitants of that
Yep.
city and go to another city. And that's exactly what he's done.
Yeah, exactly.
He didn't
yeah.
re-preach in Lystra.
No, he doesn't, no.
He went immediately to Derbe.
No, he enters the city but moves on from it. So enters the city, and you assume just like
As a witness.
as a witness, but we're not told he says anything. He enters the city, goes through the city, and then leaves the city. Is what you presume there. The brushing the dust off your sandals was a custom in the ancient Near East to do exactly what you did. It was where you would literally like we do with our hands, and sometimes that kind of sense. It's you would brush the dust off your sandals, and it was a customary sign of I'm done with you and I'm moving on to something else. So when Christ says those words to those initial 70 disciples, if you're rejected, don't keep trying to lead the horse to water. Yeah, going to make a drink. He gives one of the most important parables that he gives, which gets dramatically overlooked in our day, is to paraphrase the parable, is having the seed and you throw it on hard rocky ground. It does nothing because obviously seed doesn't grow on hard rocky ground. You throw it on soil, but it's shallow soil, and so it produces plant and fruit for a little while, but it withers away because the roots don't go deep enough. Versus the third category of throwing seed on nice, rich, nutrient-dense soil where roots grow deep and it flourishes into a great and wonderful tree. The point of that is the seed is the message of salvation and of hope and of goodness and of righteousness. Throwing it on, to use a more modern wording, throwing it on concrete will not produce results, right? And you can keep. It doesn't mean that you be flippant or that you like do it half-heartedly because you've presumed that it's going to be concrete. That's not what we're told. But if it's very clearly concrete, stop wasting your time. That's the whole point of not casting pearls before swine, to use another parable kind of phrase, another common kind of customary phrase in their day. You don't give precious things to pigs who like to wallow around in the mud and don't have no use for jewels, right? And so here, he's very clearly been rejected. Move on. Stop trying to hammer it home because there's nothing here to hammer, right? You move on, which is the point you're drawing there quite rightly. And so the next day they gets up with Barnabas, they head east to Derbe. And after they had proclaimed, verse 21, and after they had proclaimed the gospel to that city and had made many disciples, they returned to Lystra and to Iconium and to Antioch. So they go to Derbe, it's wonderfully successful, and then they start their journey home from there, right? So they return to Lystra, to Iconium and to Antioch, so they're retracing their steps, right? Strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith, and saying, through many afflictions we must enter the kingdom of God. Now, the question that gets raised here, and I'll provide what I think is probably the most likely literary interpretation. They're retracing their steps from Derbe, coming back through Lystra, Iconium and Pisidian Antioch. And we're told that they strengthen the souls of the disciples, right? They encourage the Christians that have converted in those cities. Lystra is mentioned in that city. Yeah, so in that naming of cities. The inference that has been made is that would indicate that there were people who did end up converting in Lystra, just perhaps a lot less, because the majority got whipped up into this mob and they stoned Paul. but it's possible, based on what's being said here, it is theologically possible, or even just literarily possible, that whilst the absolute preponderance did reject, and probably far more than the other cities, him having risen up and entered into the city and been seen visibly may well have caused some people to convert, right? Because they've seen God miraculously preserving him or reviving him, bringing back to life. We're not quite frankly told. The fact that Lystra is mentioned in the list would seem to more likely than not indicate that there were at least some disciples there, because otherwise it's odd. Because again, there's no break in this sentence. This is just all flowing through in the Greek. Strengthening the souls of the disciples, encouraging them to continue in the faith. It's following on immediately from Lystra, Iconium, Antioch. It would seem to suggest literally that it's more likely that there did end up being some convert. You would hope so. We're not told. That's not an objective. Like really, not like we had with Derbe. Like we just read in Derbe. And after they proclaimed the gospel in that city, verse 21, and had made many disciples. Right, so there's an explicit. One way or the other, there's scope for there being converts in Lystra here, is all I'm pointing out literally, because of the flow of the syntax of these sentences. There is definitely room for it. At the end of the day, were there mass amounts of converts in Lystra? Probably not mass amounts. Were there some? It's entirely possible. More importantly, the whole journey has been a success. That's really the broader point being made here. They encourage the new Christians and the new churches that have been founded in those cities, saying, through many afflictions we must enter the kingdom of God. I'm wanting to check end of 22. Just finding the specific word that gets used. Yeah, and its root form flips this. Persecutions, afflictions, tribulation, that's the common word that gets used for tribulation throughout, like trials and tribulation, right, persecution. And so through many afflictions, through many persecution, through much persecution, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. That would also perhaps, obviously that's not all they literally, they didn't just say one sentence. It would seem to perhaps indicate that sentence maybe strengthens the argument that there were converts in Lystra, because after all, the affliction happened in, like the trial, the affliction, the persecution, the tribulation happened in, that they faced happened in Lystra specifically. So that's kind of food for thought. But the broader theological point there is more important. Through many afflictions, through many much persecution, through many tribulations, we must enter the kingdom of God. Going forth to people who have dwelt in darkness and apart from God will bring conflict and will bring troubles and will bring, at times, not always, but at times, persecution. I forget exactly what chapter it is. I believe it's Job chapter 9. The life of man on earth is warfare. The life of man on earth is struggle, is tribulation, is difficulty. This is none of us are promised or guaranteed a nice, comfortable, happy life where nothing ever goes wrong and where there's no conflict or warfare in that sense, right? Either warfare in the sense of combativeness or conflict, or in the literal sense warfare. I'm going to try and find the reference in Job that I'm speaking to particularly. I think
about the man is born to trouble.
Man, yeah, you can translate that a couple.
Trouble as it sparks fire.
Yep, I think it's Job.
Verse or not?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it is. I'm going to find it and make sure that I've actually got the right chapter.
It's a curious verse, isn't it? 9:6 or something?
7, chapter 7.
Chapter 7.
I was close.
Yeah.
Where are we? Yeah, verse 1. You'll get different translations because the Hebrew is a bit interesting in these words. You'll get anything from, I read translations. Well, let's see what the ESV has. I think ESV has something like, is not man conscripted to hard service on the earth, I think. Yeah. ESV has not man a hard service on the earth, and are not his days like that of a hired hand. The service element can also be translated warfare. So he's not the man on life. The man of life on earth is warfare. The point being is that warfare, hardship, hard labour or hard service, the man on life is difficult, and there is conflict and there's struggles. Yeah.
The verse that I was thinking of was Job 5, verse 7.
Oh, yeah.
Man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward.
Yeah, similar wording.
Amazing.
Yeah, exactly. Similar wording. Yeah, exactly. And that's the same kind of concept repeated in chapter 7, verse 1. Is that this is difficult. And again, like the very same apostle mentions, ultimately we do not wrestle, we do not fight, we do not contest against merely flesh and blood, right? So merely the material or the mortal factors, but ultimately against powers and principalities and dominions. And these are references to the spiritual powers that often reside behind the material. Again, we don't just live in a material world. There is a unification between the material and the spiritual. Every one of us has a soul, right? A spirit, the seat of our will, and we're not just merely a random collection of atoms and neurochemicals just acting upon chance and matter. You can't explain human rationality and will and everything else along that purely naturalist, materialistic lines. And that's why every attempt to do so has failed. And so ultimately, the life of man on earth is warfare. And the contesting of for the sake of people's lives and fighting for the destiny of people's souls is not something that just is us sitting around and sharing a nice pieces of like pithy wisdom and things like that. The reality is that we are fundamentally saying, and by we I mean everyone who's come before us, including them, is fundamentally saying that we as humanity have rebelled against God. We've followed after false gods of our making, and in any way, shape or form, and that comes forth from the human heart, right? The heart kind of symbolically meaning like the will, the soul. And ultimately, we need to be reconciled to God. And that God has rescued us from that darkness and has paved the way for that reconciliation. But that involves repenting, turning away from that darkness, turning away from our unlawfulness or our rebellion against God's law, and submitting to Him as the King of Kings and as the Lord of Lords, as Lord over our life, as the one who is entirely and wholly sufficient for our lives. All those various things. Saying that in this context, outside of the act of God, an act of God, doesn't go down well, and this is just one of many, many, many examples. That's why later on, of course, the very same Apostle Paul references, in passing about how brutal his life had been, about after having converted to Christianity, things got infinitely worse for him in the mortal capacity. He once, prior to his conversion to Christ, enjoyed a life of comparative respect, renown, honour, power, and influence as well. Even at younger ages, he was kind of, in one sense, a kind of Pharisaical prodigy, at least in one sense, and was considered much honour and renown and power in his kind of capacity. After that conversion, that goes away in terms of at the popular level. But obviously it's held rightfully in high regard by the Christians, of course, which makes sense, and still is. But his life then devolves into beatings and tortures and imprisonments and going on journey and being shipwrecked and lost and going hungry and thirsty and all those kinds of things, right? But notice that it's not just like this kind of, all those difficulties are not just happening because he's like sitting in a cave and his life, it's just like life's happening to him. That's not what's happening. He's actually going out on a mission. Do you know what I mean? So he ends up getting shipwrecked because he's traveling across the Mediterranean, traveling on a mission to go and spread the gospel, right? So it's not, and that's not him. So it's not him complaining and like, oh, woe is me because my life sucks, right? No, the point he's making is that in fulfilling his destiny, in fulfilling the mandate of God, the mission of God in his life, and to advance the kingdom of God on earth, he is suffering through all of it, right? Because it's difficult, because it's arduous, because any war is arduous and difficult, right? And this is warfare. It doesn't involve swords, but it involves something more powerful than swords, which is the tongue. It involves words. It involves ideas. It involves theology, right? And that's where that's the hardcore level of warfare. It's a warfare beyond just merely the catastrophe and the destruction that can befall people through sword and shield or through guns and bombs and et cetera, et cetera. I was to give you one such kind of tidbit of what I'm getting at there. Back during the Reformation, 400 to 500 years ago, obviously a big conflict was John Knox bringing the Reformation to Scotland, and his conflicts with Mary, Queen of Scots at the time, who was very much against reforming the church and cleaning up the various corruptions that had sprung up over the course of centuries and etc. And she had many a conflict with John Knox and the other reformers there in Scotland. That's why John Knox kind of was exiled and had to flee Scotland to continental Europe for many years. But even upon his return, Mary, Queen of Scots, was quoted as one time saying that she feared the prayers of John Knox more than all the assembled armies of Europe. And she wasn't kidding when she said that, because even in her corruption and evil, she recognised that the commitment, which is what prayer is demonstrating, right? The commitment to the gospel and to the kingdom of God in someone like John Knox was more powerful than any army that could be assembled on the continent, right? And she feared him more than she feared all the assembled armies of Europe, in her own words. That's why one time when they were going at each other in the royal court, she was brought to tears because she was afraid of him. He wasn't doing anything corrupt or evil. He was telling her the truth, but evil doesn't like to be told the truth often, as we're finding out very acutely in our own day. Is that when you actually call out evil and you speak against it and you speak plainly and truthfully, people who are doing evil or corrupt things, morally, ethically and otherwise, don't tend to like that. Right? That's what I'm getting at here, right? And so his own sufferings, which we've just got a taste of here. And by the way, this is not something, I should also point this out theologically. None of this would have surprised Paul at all. He wouldn't have been shocked that he got stoned here. I'm going to get the very specific reference. It comes from his conversion. Let me find it. I'm going to say chapter. Stephen's speech. No, it's after that. Ravages the church, persecution. Stephen receives unique 9 conversion. Okay, here we go. Yep. At the conversion of Paul, what we have is in chapter 9. When Christ is speaking to Ananias, not the Ananias as in Ananias and Sapphira, the Ananias who assisted Paul and baptized him. Verse 13 of Acts chapter 9, this is what it reads, just to refresh your memory. But Ananias answered, speaking to God, Lord, I have heard from many about this man, referring to Paul, how much harm, how much damage he has done to your saints at Jerusalem. And here he has authority from the chief priests to capture all who call upon your name. Right? That's what he was doing. That's the whole point of what Paul was doing. He was running this essential death squads, very reminiscent of the Nazi SS, who would go around and hunt Christians down, capture them and kill them. Verse 17, so Ananias departed and entered the house. Where are we? Wrong sentence. Oh, sorry, back up. Verse 15, I should say, sorry. Yep. But the Lord said to him, go, for he, referring to Paul, for he is my chosen instrument to bear my name before the Gentiles and the kings and the sons of Israel, for I will show him how much he must suffer for my name.
Yeah.
Okay.
We know
There's-
that.
yeah.
Do you think Ananias told Paul those words?
I would suggest probably. We don't get the literary accounting of it. I would suggest when it says I will show him how much, I take that, and plenty of other people have too. It's definitely the majority interpretation. I take that to mean that through the Spirit of God, Paul would be made known. He would come to understand his destiny, right? That he was going to suffer painfully and brutally, and that he would eventually get killed for this. I think you can draw that conclusion for all the apostles, quite frankly, because all of them but John are ultimately murdered. Which is one of just a very, very long list of reasons why this is authentic, and we can take this as truthful, because people don't tend to be in the habit of inventing a religion just so they can all live brutally difficult lives and then all get murdered at the end of it, right? You understand? People don't tend to be in the habit of that. It doesn't mean that people don't die for what they believe. Otherwise, you wouldn't be able to explain Islamic terrorism. But that's someone being whipped up into a state of religious frenzy miles after the fact, not people living in the day who all either could verify this or not verify this, and all ended up suffering for what they clearly and consistently said, no, this actually happened and we literally saw it with our own eyes, right? That we don't have any example of that happening in human history, where hundreds of people can consistently tell you from that point forward to the day they die, no, this really did happen and I saw it happen, but in reality they all just made it up. We don't have a single example of that. That adds to the authenticity and the validity of what's being said. But what I take this verse 16 to mean, and as have many church fathers, medieval fathers, all throughout, this is that Christ, through the Spirit of God, would show and make Paul understand his fate. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. That this was his fate. He would suffer, and he would be like a warrior. He would be prepared for that, right? A big reason why a lot of our guys, for us, obviously for me, like my great grandfather, that generation who fought World War One. The reason why so many of them came back with such brutal, what they called at the time, shell shock, right? What today we refer to PTS. A big reason why that occurred is because not all, but a shockingly large percentage of them got on a ship to go over and to travel the world and to see the world, and we're going out on an expedition, and without having any real genuine spiritual, mental, like psychological preparation for the hellish abyss that they were all about to descend into, and that was made apparent when we decided to roll up ships onto a beachhead on the 25th of April with massive, heavy mounted machine gun positions up a gigantic cliff bearing down on you, and you have nowhere to run.
No.
Right? Where my great grandfather was, at Gallipoli. Has anyone been to Gallipoli?
Yes.
You have? Yeah, okay, I have too. It's just like you are literally rolling up on a beach on that side of the Hellespont. And it's just cliff, and massive heavy machine gun positions, entrenched, well equipped, rounds for days. That's before you even talk about mortar fire coming down from the cliff. It's a train wreck. And that's exactly. And that's the first. That's the welcome to war parade for Australia. That's the first time on any meaningful independent sense that we'd stepped into war. Obviously, we had the Boer War 15 or 20 years prior, but that was we weren't independent at that point. That's your first stepping into war, and like you go to Gallipoli, and it's like age 18, age 19, age 20, age 21, age 18, just all over. At the beach, at the neck, at Lone Pine, I pick a spot, right? Because completely unprepared, and had to try, and you can't just magically get prepared for war when you're in the middle of a war. It doesn't work that way. Coming from a military family, I can tell you that like vividly from experience. You don't just magically get ready for war in the middle of war. And so he has to prepare himself for the sufferings that he would have to endure. And knowing that, it's not terribly, it is in one sense reminiscent of Christ. Again, the omniscient God in flesh knew exactly what was going to happen. Do you know what I mean? This was all part of the plan. Nothing was not according to the plan. This was always the plan. This was always the plan. And this was the plan when this was the plan before he said, let there be light. This was always the plan, right? And so none of this was the backup. Like none of this was the plan B. There is no plan B. There's just plan A, and there's always been a plan A, and there is only a plan A.
There is no plan A.
Do you know what I mean? Because there are people who unfortunately, even Christians, who end up treating basically what comes after the crucifixion as like plan B, because like, oh, it was all going this way, but then the Jews killed Jesus. Like I've had conversations with Christians who like have that view. It's like, no. This, jumping back onto the Acts word, right, that through many afflictions we must enter the kingdom of God is his words. A, shows you how much he's already been preparing, but even before his first journey, his first mission for this, because that's very reminiscent of the words that Jesus said to Ananias, I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. I think in part 2, by the way, also worth pointing out, the Apostle Paul's sufferings across the span of his life are definitely comparatively unique compared to the other apostles and compared to other martyrs throughout history, right? Obviously, there's been at this point there's been countless. I mean, there's been.
But he was the one that was persecuted.
Yes, and that's why. Yeah, so that's why, right? So it's why. So Paul's an apostle, but keeping in mind Paul's not part of the 12. He's like the 13th, if you want to think of it that way, right? He's a unique apostle even in his sense, and he admits that as much himself. He didn't physically with his eyes see the physical Jesus in that 40-day period after he had risen, right? Christ miraculously appeared to him in a vision, right? And so he has seen him that way, which again is perfectly within the scope of what Christ can do, of course. And so, but the fact that he had been the arch enemy of the church meant that these sufferings, not as like judgment, nor even really as necessarily a punishment, just consequences, yeah. And so it's not like Paul is. This is kind of God putting Paul in this scenario as like, yeah, this is what you deserve. It's not like that at all, right? He will suffer greatly because he had caused much suffering, and so there is a consequence in the physical life, right? It's somewhat similar. It's not exactly the same, but it's somewhat similar to someone, and we've got countless amounts of these stories of someone who commits a horrific crime, who then goes to prison and then repents and comes to Christ. Well, they not only are they not going to get magically sprung from their prison sentence, they also don't deserve to, right? They're now our brother and sister in Christ. We love them dearly. They also still owe a debt to society. Do you know what I mean? You don't get to become a Christian in prison and then just get sprung from prison. There's still the consequences for the actions. What's the famous example I'm thinking of? Oh, it's going to annoy me. Is it Peter Keck? Let me find exactly the reference I'm thinking of. Give me 30 seconds. Is it Dharma? Maybe it is. I think the person I'm thinking of is, Jeffrey Dahmer. For those who know anything about serial killers, you know exactly who I'm talking about. It is Dahmer, yep. So Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most famous, I was just confused as to which one of them it was. It was Jeffrey Dahmer. So Jeffrey Dahmer is one of the most infamous serial killers in American history. Known colloquially as the Milwaukee Monster. He's passed away these days. But he was active back in the 70s and mainly the 80s, I think it was, or maybe the 80s and the 90s. No, 1978 to 1991, so the end of the 70s and then through the 80s, where he lured, killed, raped, ate dozens of men/boys. I think the number is about 16 off memory, 17, close enough, across that 12 to 13 year period, where he would, as I mentioned, usually lure them to a hotel. He would kill them, usually by strangling them to death. He would then rape their corpse, so necrophilia, and then would, for most of them, cut them up and eat them. Okay.
Really? This happened?
Yeah. Yes. Yes, it's this thing called evil, and so, yep. And there are worse serial killers than him, but that's up there, certainly in terms of numbers and
Did he get converted?
in prison, very, very reliably converted. Yeah, to the point where I have virtually zero question about when you read the story. A solid. His father was a Christian. I don't know the status of the mother. I don't think the mother was in the picture, which also probably explained part of the development of him. But that part aside, the father, to my knowledge, was a Christian. To what degree, I have no idea, but at least was professing. But in prison, managed to come into contact with, and I went and looked up. It was years ago now, but I found no fault in the minister, the pastor who ministered to him in prison. I found him perfectly solid, and then he converts to Christ in prison, quite reliably. Everything that's coming out of it, the theology coming out of his mouth shows a clear change. His disposition. You watch interviews of him, and there's a clear change even in just his countenance and everything else. Now, beyond an act of like world-class manipulation, I find his conversion to be thoroughly reliable.
So was he possessed when he was doing all this other stuff?
It's entirely possible, for sure. We're going to see examples of that in church history on Sunday when it comes to the zealots. But yeah, it's absolutely entirely possible. The other thing that people need to realise too, it is also possible to be not doing that, being influenced or possessed by the demonic, because human beings, when they're unrestrained, are that evil. We just don't like to accept the fact, but it's not. We just don't like to accept that, but that is what it is. But there's a clear conversion to Christ, and so what ends up happening for him in prison is he perfectly accepts that he must remain in prison. The big struggle for him is that he can't reconcile in his head why it would be just for him to keep living in prison. No, I don't mean like being released. I mean the big struggle that pastor has to help him with is that he wants to kill himself so badly because that should be the just penalty for what I've done. Because he wasn't given the death penalty. He was just given life imprisonment off memory. He was given like 16 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. So he was condemned to 1,000 years in prison. And it's because the Americans do consecutive life sentences in that sense, because that's a good thing, because it's accounting for each of the crimes. But he wasn't given the death penalty, because I'm pretty sure Wisconsin does not have the death penalty. And so he was just given life imprisonment. But for him, the just penalty for what he had done is death, and he's right, because whether we like it or not, in our soft, weak age, the biblical punishment for murder is death, and that's very clearly spelled out. Because it shows you the value of life. You can't just unjustly take life, right? The death penalty is just for a crime like murder. And so eventually, long story short, it doesn't particularly end up mattering, because I think not long after, about 18 months, he gets killed in prison by other inmates. So there's 1,000 different ways one could interpret that story. One could look at it as I know it might sound odd to say, but when you think biblically, it's not. One could look at that as an act of mercy on God's part. You could look, right, as opposed to suffering through a life of imprisonment and having to constantly deal with, why haven't I been killed for these things? Which also shows you, by the way, the change, a genuine change of repentance and the fruit of that, because he's thinking about the justice of God. That's good luck. It's difficult to explain without that. You asked me earlier about the demonic possession, which is why I argue well, whether he was or wasn't is almost immaterial. His explanation is actually really clear, and boy, people hate when I tell this story. His explanation as to why he did it was because he was an atheist.
Because he was an atheist.
There is no God. There is therefore no moral constraints. I can therefore do what I want.
But why on earth would you want to do what he did?
Because that's what happens when the human will is completely released from any moral constraint. I can do what I want. Why did we've covered it in church history as well. Why was Nero the absolutely monstrous human being that he? And I've only given tidbits because Nero hasn't been the focus. If we were doing obviously a Bible study in Revelation, he would become the focus. But he hasn't been the focus in church history because we've been wanting to focus on Jerusalem, right? But Nero was unbelievable, just truly horrific. And I said this on the weekend. You would be hard pressed to find someone as evil as Nero in history. Hitler is. I'm not trying to minimize it. He is nothing compared to Nero. Nothing, utterly nothing. All those actions of Hitler and Himmler, Reinhard, like Heydrich, all that's external stuff. Like Hitler wasn't running around the forest rounding up pregnant Jews and putting a bullet in their head, right? He was commanding those things. Nero was the one who would have Christians crucified and then lit on fire to light the garden parties he was holding for the senators, right? Nero is the one who in the middle of parties would get a Christian and tie them up to a stake, like a pole, strip them naked. He would then himself strip naked. He would then put on an animal cloak, be it bear, wolf, even leopard from Africa, and would then go into an ecstatic frenzy, drug-induced or not, and then start tearing shreds off the person still living and eating them, right? So he's cannibalistic, right? He routinely dressed up as a woman. He routinely had sex with men dressed as a woman, right? So like, obviously transgenderism, autogynephilia, all those kinds of things, right? Evil, okay? Because this is what human beings can do. Ta-da, right? I know it's I'm not. Huh?
Nothing new under the sun.
No, nothing new under the sun. Oh, no, nothing new under the sun. The stuff you see going out in our society regarding transgenderism and what it really is a lot of the time, which is, and I'll explain the word on the weekend when I mention it, autogynephilia, which just means auto, self, gyno, woman, philia, love. So autogynephilia is what accounts for a lot of what you see as transgenderism, which is particularly men, in this case autogynephilia, men receiving sexual gratification from dressing like a woman and receiving recognition as a woman and she, her pronouns, all that stuff. That's an established thing. It's just that people don't like to admit that that's what's going on. But we're going to see examples of that in the siege of Jerusalem, where people start doing that in Jerusalem. Believe it or not. We'll get onto that.
Way back then.
In Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem, the absolute demonic possession that overcame that city is horrific, and Josephus accounts it for us. I'll save it for the weekend. But you have the zealots engaging in transgenderism and all kinds of things. We'll get to that in the weekend. To circle back to the point I'm drawing here, the story with Jeffrey Dahmer that I take from that is that his conversion, which I do legitimately believe, all things considered, didn't abscond him from the punishment that he deserved to face, which in reality was death, and he knew that. That's why it was such a struggle for him. He was struggling just to make it through the day because he knew he deserved death, but had only been given life imprisonment because with Constant, as I said, I'm pretty sure doesn't have the death penalty anymore. And so he ends up dying, getting killed by other inmates, which may have been an act of mercy on God's part. We think that's great. Oh, what? God getting killed? No, but that's saving him from decades of suffering and anguish, and it's an act of mercy by taking him out now. The point being made is that even though he had done these horrible things that didn't and converted to Christ, that didn't miraculously preserve him from consequences. Same with Paul. He had killed bombloads of Christians by this point, right? That doesn't avert him from consequences, and so he is then, as the chief apostle to the nations, to the Gentiles, is going to suffer a lot for that, but will ultimately come through that and be greatly rewarded by God. That's the fundamental point. And so they appoint elders in every church, and they commend them to the Lord. And let's just finish with these last verses. This all flows through pretty quickly from here. Verse 24 of Acts 14. And when they passed through Pisidia, they came to Pamphylia. And when they had spoken the word in Perga, they came down to Italia. And from there, they then sailed to Antioch, and this is obviously Syrian Antioch, the Antioch headquarters, from where they had been committed to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. So again, this is all very resolute language. The mission was a success. Verse 27, and when they arrived at Antioch, at Syrian Antioch, and gathered the church together, they began to report all the things that God had done with them, and how he had opened a door of faith to the Gentiles. And they spent not a little time with the disciples. Not a little time is Luke's common phraseology for they spent a lot of time. They didn't spend just a little bit of time. They spent a lot of time at Antioch.
And mine says, and there they abode long time.
Yeah.
with the apostles.
Yeah, long time. Yeah, exact same thing. Yeah, and so they come back to Antioch. It's a mission success. Of course, the church at Antioch would have been thinking about them and praying for them very ardently and consistently, obviously for months and months and months here at this point, and for quite a long time throughout all this journey, right? Which comparatively speaking has gone further than this is as far as the gospel has gone west at this point, and so you end up having it's a big journey comparatively speaking, and so to come back to Antioch where they all have been waiting for them. And ardently thinking about him, hoping that they were okay. It's not like they would be we're not told that they're given, they're not sitting by the phone waiting for like daily reports, obviously. And so they will have been waiting, hoping that they come back, hoping that they even survive. All these kinds of things would have been running through their head. And so then it's great news, and they gather them all together. They tell them all that God had done. Obviously, they probably would have told, and you would probably still be able to see the physical wounds on Paul, no doubt, and how he had opened, this Luke's wording here, how God had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles, is not unique wording, but it's just interesting in terms of talking about the providence of God, like the sovereignty of God, as like opening a door to the Gentiles. So that the Gentiles might enter into the kingdom of God. It's just it's touching phraseology here on Luke's part, and that's where this story ends. And so in the next chapter 15, is where we move into the famous Council of Jerusalem in AD 50, which is the first ecumenical church council. And so we'll obviously spend a number of weeks going through that chapter and through that council as the first church council, which is convened in Jerusalem, obviously as the name, in AD 50, we know from historical sources, to resolve a very significant and problematic issue that had arisen in the churches, that sets up, that even frames how we understand other books, like particularly Paul's letter to the Galatians. So I'll leave it there. Does anyone have any questions or additional comments regarding what we've covered here in the end of chapter 14? Very good. Alrighty. So we'll leave it there. As I said, next lesson we'll pick up in the beginning of Acts chapter 15. Thank you.